In the dark, frigid skies over Europe, there was a moment every American bomber crewman dreaded. It came after the thunder of engines had become a background hum, after the formation had climbed through the gray soup of low cloud and broken into the thin, bitter air high above. It came when they crossed a line, an invisible, where the friendly silver fighters that had shepherded them from English bases had no choice but to turn back. The bombers kept going. Alone, that line was death. For months, German fighter pilots had learned to wait just beyond the range of American escort fighters. They didn't need to rush. They'd hover in their sleek, deadly Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, letting the bomber streams lumber closer, counting on the limitations of American fuel tanks like vultures circling a wounded animal. When the escorts peeled away, the Luftwaffe pounced, especially the big, lumbering B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator, had machine guns bristling from almost every angle. But that was never enough. No matter how tight the combat box, no matter how disciplined the crews, the German fighters could swarm them in numbers, hitting the same formation from multiple angles. Entire bomber groups were shredded in minutes. The problem wasn't courage. The American bomber crews had courage in obscene abundance. The problem was distance. The Luftwaffe owned the air over Germany because the Americans couldn't stay with their bombers all the way to the target and back. Their sleek, fast P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning fighters didn't have the legs for a Berlin run. Every time the bombers reached the deepest targets, they were on their own, and every time. But history can hinge on the smallest, most unexpected inventions. Not a new engine, not a new wing, not a new gun. A tank, a simple fuel tank, an auxiliary fuel tank, to be exact, a paper fuel tank. The idea didn't come from a famous general or an aviation legend. It came from a quiet engineer. Someone who saw the problem not through the lens of tactics or dogfighting glory, but through simple arithmetic. How do you make a fighter fly farther without making it too heavy to fight? The P-51 Mustang had been a promising plane from the start. Sleek, elegant, and fast, it could dance with German fighters in a way the Thunderbolts and Lightnings couldn't quite manage. More importantly, its engine, particularly the version with the Rolls-Royce Merlin, drank less fuel and performed brilliantly at high altitudes. But even the P-51 had a range problem. It could get partway to Berlin, not all the way. That's where the engineer's idea came in. Conventional drop tanks, extra fuel tanks slung under the wings or belly of the plane, already existed. But they were made of metal. That meant they were expensive, used precious materials needed elsewhere. And worst of all, they were reusable. You didn't want your pilots dumping good metal into enemy territory. That made logistics complicated and supplies tight. The engineer proposed something different. What if the tanks didn't have to be saved? What if they were cheap? What if they were disposable? The answer seemed absurd at first: make the tanks out of paper. Not just any paper, of course. Laminated layers of treated paper and resin, lightweight, durable enough to hold aviation fuel for a few hours and cheap enough to throw away. Paper fuel tanks. The idea was so simple it bordered on ridiculous. But war doesn't care about elegance. It cares about what works. And these tanks worked. They were light. They were cheap. They could be mass-produced in the thousands. And they gave the P-51 something it had never had before: legs. Real legs. With paper drop tanks slung under their wings, P-51s could stay with the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The line of death was about to disappear. The Luftwaffe didn't know it yet, but its window of dominance was closing. The hunters were about to become the hunted. Before the paper tank, bomber missions to Berlin were brutal exercises in attrition. In some raids, entire squadrons failed to return. The bomber crews were brave, but courage doesn't stop cannon shells. Escort fighters were their lifeline, and when that lifeline broke, the sky turned red. But one day in 1944, the German fighter pilots who had laughed at the Americans' short-range escorts began to see something different. The Mustangs didn't turn back. They stayed. Imagine the shock. A Luftwaffe pilot climbing toward a bomber stream sees those familiar silver planes on the horizon. He knows the escorts will wheel around soon. He's planned his attack accordingly. But today, the silver fighters keep coming. They don't peel away. They drop their paper tanks and come screaming down into the German formation. The hunter suddenly has claws in his face. That shift, the quiet genius of a disposable fuel tank, turned the strategic air war over Europe upside down. For the first time, the Americans could project fighter power deep into German airspace, not just over the coast, not just to the border, but right over the Reich itself. The P-51 didn't just escort bombers anymore. It dominated the airspace. It began sweeping ahead of the bomber formations, tearing into Luftwaffe interceptors before they even reached the bombers. By the time the German fighters scrambled, the Mustangs were already there. The Germans went from hunters to prey almost overnight, and it all started with something as unglamorous as a paper tank. The change wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. Bomber crews who once faced those long, frozen, terrifying stretches of unescorted flight suddenly had company. When the Luftwaffe came for them, the Mustangs were still there. The chatter over the radio changed. Morale soared. The fear that used to set in when escorts peeled away began to vanish. For the Germans, the shock cut just as deep. Pilots who had spent months perfecting their interception tactics found themselves ambushed instead. The skies over Berlin, once a killing ground, were turning into a battlefield where the Luftwaffe was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and outgunned. The shift was so dramatic that German pilots began calling the Mustangs little friends, not in admiration, but in bitter recognition of their deadly new reality. Behind that shift, behind the statistics and sortie numbers and kill ratios, was an engineer with an idea so humble, it almost didn't happen. A paper tank, a few extra gallons of fuel, a new line drawn not in fear, but in reach. It's one of the quiet miracles of wartime innovation. Not all game changers wear capes or command squadrons. Some sit in workshops, sketching ideas others might laugh at, and end up changing the course of a war. In the spring of 1944, the air war over Europe shifted in ways that the German high command couldn't fully grasp at first. To them, it looked like the same bomber streams that had thundered across the Channel for months, the same shimmering columns of B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator bombers climbing to altitude in massive formations. But tucked beneath the wings of the sleek P-51 Mustang fighters were the quiet engines of change, the disposable paper fuel tanks that gave the Americans reach. The engineer behind this breakthrough had not set out to make history. He wasn't thinking about Berlin, or the Luftwaffe, or strategic air campaigns. He was thinking about a math problem: how to give a fighter more range without compromising its agility. Every pound mattered. Metal tanks were strong but heavy, aluminum was precious. Reusability seemed logical in peacetime, but in war, logic bends to need. And what the Allies needed was an escort that could fly farther than anything the Germans could throw at them. So he proposed something that seemed ridiculous on paper, literally. Tanks made from layers of impregnated paper and resin. They would be filled with high-octane aviation fuel and then, when empty, jettisoned without a second thought. They wouldn't come back to base. They didn't have to. When the first paper tanks appeared, they looked fragile. Pilots were skeptical. They joked about flying with milk cartons under their wings. Some feared they'd burst or catch fire from stray gunfire. But test after test proved they were reliable enough to get the job done. And once they were in the field, the transformation was instant. P-51 squadrons based in England could now escort bombers to the most distant targets in Germany. For the first time, the bombers had continuous coverage from takeoff to target and back. That meant raids could be planned not around the endurance of the escort fighters, but around the strategic value of the target. Berlin was no longer too far. For the German fighter pilots, the first time they realized something had changed must have felt like a trap. They rose into the sky, expecting the usual pattern: the escorts would turn back somewhere near the border, and the bombers would fly on alone. But this time the escorts didn't peel away. The silver fighters with their distinctive shark-like lines stayed in formation. Then they dropped their tanks. The Luftwaffe pilots who thought they were about to feast suddenly found themselves swarmed. The Mustangs had range, speed, and altitude. German formations that once hid unprotected bombers were now ambushed before they could even line up their shots. It wasn't just a tactical change. It was a complete rewriting of the rules of the air war. Before, the paper tank bomber missions often suffered staggering losses. A single raid could cost dozens of aircraft and hundreds of lives. The Luftwaffe strategy was simple: wait until the bombers were alone, then strike with overwhelming force. It worked too well. The Americans knew they couldn't sustain those kinds of losses forever. But with the paper tanks, everything shifted. The Mustangs no longer operated like short-range defenders. They became hunters. They flew ahead of the bombers, sweeping German skies clean. They went after the Luftwaffe where it lived, on its own turf. Suddenly, German fighter bases that once felt safe were under constant harassment. The Luftwaffe wasn't just losing planes in the air. It was losing them on the ground, destroyed before they could even take off. Every gallon of fuel in those paper tanks extended that reach. Every mile gained shrank the Luftwaffe's world. For bomber crews, the change was emotional as much as strategic. Imagine sitting in a B-17 Flying Fortress, high above the continent, your oxygen mask frosting over, your gun turrets icing up, and your hands shaking not from fear but from the cold. You know the Luftwaffe is out there. You know the moment the escorts turn home is the moment the wolves appear. That fear lived in every man on every bomber. And then one day, the escorts didn't leave. The Mustangs were still there when the German fighters came in. They saw the contrails of their little friends streaking in to intercept. For many bomber crews, that moment felt like salvation. The morale boost was enormous. Men who used to whisper prayers during the unescorted stretches of missions now whispered thanks when they saw the P-51s alongside them deep over Germany. It changed the psychology of the bomber offensive. The bombers could push deeper, hit harder, and come back alive. And for the Luftwaffe, the effect was devastating. Their tactics depended on timing and surprise. Without those, their numerical advantage dissolved. They were forced into chaotic, costly dogfights far from their bases. Pilots who once controlled the battlefield found themselves outmatched and outnumbered. The paper tank wasn't just extending range. It was compressing the Luftwaffe's options. When the United States Army Air Forces realized how effective the tanks were, production ramped up at staggering speed. Factories on the home front churned out thousands of disposable paper tanks. They were cheap. They didn't use critical aluminum or steel. They could be stacked in warehouses, shipped overseas, and bolted onto fighters in minutes. Logistically, it was genius. Instead of worrying about recovering metal tanks, ground crews treated the paper tanks as expendable. Fighters took off loaded, burned through their external fuel first, dropped the tanks, and went into combat at full strength with full internal tanks. No extra weight, no wasted resources, just reach. That reach translated into power. Missions that once required careful planning around fuel limits suddenly had flexibility. Fighter groups could adjust mid-mission, chase retreating enemies, or cover bomber formations longer than ever before. Targets that were once considered too distant became routine. And with that, Berlin itself was no longer an untouchable fortress. The psychological blow to the German leadership was immense. The capital of the Reich had been out of reach of American escort fighters for most of the war. Now, P-51s were tearing through its skies. German fighter pilots who once took pride in defending their heartland now faced an enemy that followed them home. The impact rippled through the entire air campaign. German aircraft production was already under strain. Now, factories building interceptors and bombers were being hit more frequently and more effectively. Fighter groups that once concentrated their power against bomber streams were stretched thin defending multiple fronts. Every time a Mustang landed in England after a Berlin run, it meant one less safe place for the Luftwaffe to hide. The most astonishing part of this transformation wasn't how dramatic it was, but how quietly it began. No fanfare, no headlines. Just a paper tank, a disposable, ugly, practical solution to an impossible problem. In many ways, that's how wars are won, not by grand gestures but by solving the small, brutal equations that decide whether men live or die in the sky. That engineer's idea gave the P-51 the legs it needed to become more than a fighter. It became a scalpel cutting into the heart of the Luftwaffe's air defense network, and every German pilot who looked up and saw those Mustangs still there, still coming, understood that something fundamental had changed. It wasn't just another raid anymore. It was a storm they could no longer outrun. The first time the Mustangs escorted bombers all the way to Berlin, it didn't just mark a tactical success. It sent a shockwave through the German high command. For months, German intelligence had built its confidence on one unshakable assumption: American fighters couldn't go the distance. They believed the bomber streams were like a serpent with a fragile head, protected early on, exposed at the heart, vulnerable deep inside the Reich. They were wrong. The Mustangs didn't just make it to Berlin. They owned Berlin's skies. German pilots, trained to time their interceptions at the very moment the escorts peeled away, suddenly found themselves on the defensive. Instead of diving on bombers, they were looking over their shoulders at fighters with sharper claws and longer reach. Before the paper tank, the P-51 Mustang was already a formidable aircraft. With its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, its climb rate, speed, and agility were exceptional. In a turning fight or high-speed chase, the Mustang could outmatch most German fighters, including the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Foch Wolf 190. But that strength was always shackled by one limitation: fuel. That's what the paper tanks broke wide open. Now, instead of peeling away somewhere over the Ruhr, Mustang pilots stayed on. They crossed the heart of Germany. They flew over Berlin, Leipzig, Dresden, and they didn't just defend the bomber streams, they went looking for trouble. By 1944, the United States Army Air Forces had begun shifting from a purely defensive escort strategy to aggressive fighter sweeps. Mustang groups began flying ahead of the bombers, clearing the skies before the lumbering B-17 Flying Fortress formations even arrived. German fighter units that scrambled to intercept the bombers were being chewed up before they could get anywhere near their targets. It was like a knife twisting in the Luftwaffe's ribs. The German air defense network had been built on the idea of concentrated power. By waiting until the bombers were unescorted, they could throw large numbers of fighters at them in coordinated waves. That strategy depended on timing. Timing depended on fuel, and fuel depended on range. The Americans had just broken that equation suddenly. The Luftwaffe couldn't predict where or when the escorts would disappear. Because they didn't. The Mustangs followed them all the way in. Pilots like those in the 8th Air Force now had the power to do something unthinkable just months earlier: loiter over enemy territory. They could escort the bombers, engage the Luftwaffe, and still have the endurance to chase targets home. It wasn't just about numbers in the air. It was about the fear that began to creep in on the German side. For German pilots, the cockpit had always been their hunting ground. The bomber streams were big, slow, and easy to spot. The escorts left eventually. The Germans had the advantage of home turf, but as the paper tanks gave the Mustangs reach, that psychological edge began to erode. Luftwaffe pilots who once attacked with confidence now flew with uncertainty. Would the Mustangs be there? Would they be waiting? Would the hunter become the prey the moment he rolled in for a shot? And more often than not, the answer was yes. On the American side, the change in morale was immediate and overwhelming. Bomber crews that had once endured deadly, silent stretches of flight now had fighter cover from start to finish. The familiar terror that came when the escorts turned back simply disappeared. The sky, once a graveyard of burning bombers, now seemed just a little less cold. The Mustang pilots themselves became legends. These weren't just escorts. They were the tip of the spear. They chased down interceptors, strafed airfields, and tangled with the Luftwaffe in their own backyard. German pilots began describing the new reality in grim terms. The Mustang wasn't just another fighter, it was a hunter with endless stamina. Even if a German fighter managed to disengage, the Mustang could follow him home, often strafing his base minutes later. The Luftwaffe's losses began to spike. Aircraft production in Germany was already under immense strain from the relentless bombing campaign. Now the Luftwaffe wasn't just losing planes in combat, they were losing pilots, experienced aces, men who had fought since the early days of the war, were being picked off by Mustang pilots who now had the fuel to press every fight. In aerial warfare, fuel is more than fuel. It's freedom, it's power. It means you decide when the fight ends, not your enemy. The disposable paper tanks gave the Mustang that freedom. The irony is that such a small, humble piece of technology, thin laminated paper soaked in resin, became the key that unlocked strategic dominance. It didn't look like much. It wasn't glamorous. Pilots sometimes laughed when they saw them being attached under their wings. But they didn't laugh once they were over Berlin, still flying strong while the Luftwaffe scrambled below. The engineer who had designed the tanks couldn't have known how profound the impact would be. He was solving a practical problem, not rewriting history. But that's often how war changes course, not with grand designs, but with small, brutal efficiencies that tip the scales. For the bomber crews, the paper tanks weren't just a technical innovation. They were a lifeline. Every extra mile of range meant more Mustangs overhead. Every Mustang overhead meant another bomber crew making it home. And for the Luftwaffe, every extra mile meant the shrinking of their once dominant airspace. It's one thing to fight on equal ground. It's another to realize your enemy can now strike you anywhere, anytime, with a weapon that isn't even a weapon in the traditional sense. The German pilots began calling the Mustangs the ghosts, because they were everywhere. Even missions planned around avoiding escort coverage were being intercepted. They couldn't outfly the tanks. They couldn't outlast them, and that slow suffocation of German air power was far more devastating than any single dogfight. What followed was a chain reaction. With the Luftwaffe forced on the defensive, bomber missions became more effective. More factories were destroyed. More airfields were cratered. More fuel depots went up in flames. And the Luftwaffe, already struggling to keep pace with attrition, began to crumble from the inside. This wasn't a glamorous kind of victory. It wasn't the stuff of poster headlines. It was a cold, methodical stranglehold. One that began with something so simple, so unassuming, that few realized its power at first. But the pilots in the air knew. They could feel it in their hands on the stick, their boots on the rudder pedals, their lungs in the thin, icy air above Germany. They could feel it when the Mustangs stayed with them past the point where every previous mission had grown silent and deadly. They could feel it when the Luftwaffe stopped being the hunter. By early 1945, the air war over Europe no longer resembled the brutal, uncertain skies of just 2 years before. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Allied bomber crews, was now a shadow of its former self. Its veteran pilots had been thinned out by endless engagements. Its airfields lay in ruin, strafed and bombed until even taking off felt like a gamble. Its factories, once humming with production, were being hit again and again, deep inside the heart of the Reich. And one of the quiet forces behind this transformation was a humble piece of laminated paper hanging beneath the wings of a P-51 Mustang. It's almost poetic, how something so small could carry such weight. The disposable paper fuel tank was never meant to be glamorous. It didn't make headlines the way bombers or famous aces did. But it gave the Allies what the Luftwaffe feared most: reach. It turned the Mustang from a short-range defender into a hunter capable of following its prey home. When the first Mustangs crossed Berlin with bombers and made it home, it was a technical triumph. When they did it again and again, it became a strategic hammer blow. Luftwaffe leadership watched the balance tilt and tried to adapt. They scattered their aircraft across smaller fields. They dispersed production to hidden facilities. They shifted their tactics, hoping to lure the escorts into unfavorable fights. But the problem wasn't tactics anymore. It was time. They were running out of it. The paper tank had changed the tempo of the war. Before it, the Americans had been forced to fight on a schedule. Escorts turned back at a predictable point. Raids followed predictable routes. The Luftwaffe always had a window. After it, that window slammed shut. Mustangs began appearing over cities the Germans had once considered too deep to fear. They loitered over airfields, waiting for interceptors to scramble. They caught bombers returning to base. They strafed trains, convoys, fuel depots, anything that kept the Luftwaffe's machine alive. And they could do it because of those tanks. To the bomber crews, the change was visceral. Once upon a time, a raid to Berlin felt like rolling dice with death. You might get there. You might not. You knew the escort would leave you. You knew the Luftwaffe would come. It was a ritual of fear. Then came the missions when the Mustangs stayed. The bombers could see their silver wings glinting alongside them even as they approached Berlin. They could hear their voices over the radio, calm and steady, promising that this time they weren't alone. Veterans would later describe those moments with a kind of awe. The psychological weight of isolation, the hollow silence after the escorts peeled away, was gone, replaced by the steady hum of confidence. The Mustangs had their backs, and for the German pilots, the sky itself seemed to shrink. The Reich's airspace, once their hunting ground, had become a cage. The Luftwaffe's most experienced pilots, men who had racked up dozens of kills, found themselves outnumbered, outgunned, and, most crushing of all, outlasted. They could not simply disengage and wait for the bombers to bleed. The Mustangs chased them home. They strafed their bases. They destroyed their planes on the ground. Every mile of Mustang range carved out another piece of German air power. The disposable paper tanks had solved the one problem that had given the Luftwaffe a fighting chance. And they did it in the simplest, most brutal way possible, by erasing distance. The Luftwaffe had always relied on geography. German fighters didn't need to fly far. They were defending their own homeland. The Americans had to come to them. Fuel, range, and time were their allies. That equation kept them in the fight long after their factories started burning. But once the paper tanks gave the Allies equal reach, geography was no longer a shield. The Mustangs didn't just escort bombers anymore. They roamed, they swept ahead. They turned the Luftwaffe's own homeland into a battlefield where the Germans no longer dictated the terms. The results were devastating. By late 1944 and early 1945, Luftwaffe losses were accelerating. New German pilots, many barely trained, were thrown into fights against seasoned Mustang squadrons who had fuel to pick their engagements carefully. The Germans could not afford drawn-out dogfights. The Americans could, and the more the Luftwaffe blood, the less it could protect its cities, factories, and troops. That's the quiet, terrifying power of logistics. A war is often won not by the biggest guns or fastest planes, but by the side that can sustain pressure longer. The paper tank was the kind of invention that seems almost laughable at first glance. And yet it's precisely that kind of invention that breaks the back of an enemy who thought he understood the rules. When the United States Army Air Forces began escorting bombers all the way to Berlin, the German public began to understand something. Their pilots already knew the sky no longer belonged to them. They could hear the roar of engines overhead, not just at the front but in their own capital. They could look up and see American fighters where once only German interceptors flew. The effect was both material and psychological. Industrial targets were obliterated with growing precision. Transportation networks collapsed. supply lines frayed, and the morale of the German population, once buoyed by the Luftwaffe's promise of air defense, began to crack. At the center of that shift was a fighter that had finally grown the wings it needed. Not because its design changed, but because someone had given it a little more gas. It's easy to glorify the Mustang itself: sleek, fast, deadly. The P-51 Mustang has earned every ounce of its legendary status. But the truth behind its legend is not just in its speed or its guns. It's in the quiet genius of a logistical solution. The paper tank gave the Mustang the ability to rewrite the rules of the war. A German ace might outfly an American in a single engagement, but the Mustang could keep coming back, over and over, all the way to Berlin, all the way home, and the Luftwaffe simply couldn't keep up. As 1945 ground on, the bomber streams grew thicker, the Mustang coverage denser, the German defense more desperate. What had once been a dangerous gamble, flying deep into enemy territory, became almost routine. Losses didn't vanish entirely, but the balance had shifted decisively. All of this because one engineer, staring at the cold math of range and endurance, had asked a simple question: what if the tank didn't have to come back? That idea became a paper tank. That tank became longer missions. Those missions became victories in the sky, and those victories helped shatter the Luftwaffe's grip on the air, paving the way for the Allied advance on the ground. Wars are rarely decided by a single weapon. They're decided by 1,000 small, interconnected advantages. Some are loud, some are quiet. But when history looks back, it often finds that the loud victories were built on quiet inventions. The Mustang's paper fuel tank is one of those inventions. It never fired a shot, but it made every shot possible. It never flew a mission, but it carried every mission farther. It never became famous like the pilots who soared above Berlin, but it made their legends possible. And somewhere, in a workshop far from the front, an engineer probably never imagined that his paper tank would help bring a war to its knees.